I call this concept self-retirement. It came as a bit of a shock when I first understood that myself, as you know, the that I will never and not ever reach enlightenment. Now, how disappointing is that? The reason is that the self, as the Buddhists know it, is nothing more than the sum total of all our attachments, positive and negative, our likes and our dislikes. So at best, the self is a kind of general secretary for our life, and not any kind of permanent being or vantage point. This assemblage, or the montage of what makes up what we call ourself, changes as our interests change. And like an onion, the self has no inside permanent core. When we die, according to the Buddhists, the self is gone, but the mind is not. So I find the idea humorous that should I become enlightened, myself as I know it won't be around to see it. Lots of laughs. In other words, the self can't be the natural vantage point it appears to be now from which to survey life as we gradually become more aware. And why is that? Because becoming aware of the true nature of the mind is concomitant with a thinning out and a dissolving of the attachment to the self. And the self being largely all our personal attachments, our likes and dislikes. It's like our personal scrapbook, what we've drawn around ourselves like a persona, a mask. Sooner or later, all of that, they all have to go. The attachments, gone. Not what we're attached to, just the attachments. And with it goes the hope, any hope that we have of someday carrying the self as we know it, ourself, on into the next world or life. And it's good to think on this. In other words, as we become increasingly more aware, the self becomes increasingly transparent at the same time, and less important as a refuge or as an attachment. We discover that the self is not, quote, the decider. And ultimately, we gradually switch vantage point. And this is what's so important to understand, at least it was for me. We stop viewing everything from the point of view of our attachments, of ourself. We stop being, in the general word, selfish, because we discover it's an exercise in futility. That's why. Now, this is not to say that we should not have or will not continue to have a self when we're enlightened, because the self is nothing more than a practical personal secretary, a list keeper, that we'd have to invent it if we didn't already have one. And like a good secretary, the self is like a butler to something more important and greater than itself. And no puns intended there. Whatever we could agree that is, we could call it awareness, enlightenment, whatever. However, most of us did not set out in life to be our own secretary. And the secretary does not usually run the whole show, but the self will, if we let it. In other words, we're not just ourselves, if that makes any sense. The point here is that while the self is not about to just dry up and blow away, the extreme emphasis and concern with the self, call it our selfishness or attachment to the self, will soften And our awareness or our extreme focus on the self will shift away from that vantage point. Actually, we'll see through it to something more encompassing, something even more natural. And again, let's not forget that the Buddhists point out that this cluster of attachments that we call ourself will not be traveling with us when we go. And they advise us not to put all our eggs in that basket, and certainly don't count on it. As I like to say, I reached a point in my life where I just put myself out to pasture to graze as we would an old cow. And I do my best to make sure that it has enough hay and sunshine to be happy. But I have ceased to consider myself as the be-all and the end-all authority of anything. At this point, I can, at least to some degree, laugh at myself. A little. And the proof of the pudding is that I have begun to treat myself as I would treat any other person, with as much love and kindness and compassion as I can manage, which isn't always a lot. However, I've been reminded, and more than once by those around me, that perhaps I like myself too much. But I just say in response that perhaps you don't like yourself enough. After all, the self is really harmless when seen for what it is, and it's okay to like oneself. It's nothing to be ashamed of or to beat around the bush about. In fact, we are free to like ourselves and offer no apologies, even if no one else does. And here's a little poem I wrote just about that, years ago. It's called Me and You. The fact that I like me does not mean I don't like you. There's room for you in me, and you can like you too. You too are like me. I like you too.